Hello everyone, I'm happy today to introduce the first in the FIIN seminar series. It's an exciting project based on feminist institutionalism in the African context, based on a book that's been edited by Diana Højlund Madsen. The book deals with 8 different countries, and in today's seminar, chaired by my colleague Georgina Waylen from Manchester University, the seminar looks at 3 of the case studies in the book. The first related to Ghana, the second related to Malawi, and the third related to South Africa. So Georgina will chair the session, and I'll hand over to Georgina now.
What can FI contribute? And I think this feeds into the wider questions about how far feminist institutionalist concepts and analyses can travel, as some comparative politics people put it. What are the potential problems and limitations of trying to do this? So, for example, how can we maintain contextual specificity, which is often seen as so important in all sorts of analyses? So it kind of leads us to think about these bigger questions about how generalizable are feminist institutionalist concepts and ideas that were developed initially and primarily by scholars in the global north. Do they have any general applicability, some general applicability, or how far is this limited? And if there is some kind of traveling that's possible, is this in the questions that are asked? Is it in the concepts that are used, the methods, the approaches, or what? And what are the limits to this? And certainly here at FIIN, we believe it's important to think about these questions and engage in dialogue and exchange about these issues and ideas with a range of different scholars in different locations. So I'm sure these presentations are going to provide us a lot of food for thought and about these and other important issues. So now, in terms of the practicalities, we're going to have presentations of about 15 minutes from each of the speakers, and I'll introduce each of the speakers in detail just before they speak, and then we'll have time at the end for a Q&A and also responses from the speakers a bit to each other's presentations and the kind of overall questions around feminist institutionalism. So firstly, I'll now introduce Diana Højlund Madsen, who is a senior gender researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute at Uppsala in Sweden and a research fellow at the University of the Free State in South Africa. And her research has focused primarily on women's representation, gender and democratization, gender mainstreaming, and gender and conflict, especially and particularly with a focus on Ghana and Rwanda. And she's currently coordinator of 2 projects, Gendered Institutions and Political Representation in Africa, which of course this book comes out of, and Global Talk, Local Walk, the translation of women, peace and security agenda into practice in Africa. So I'll now hand over to Diana.
Yes, as Georgina said, my name is Diana Højlund Madsen. I'm the editor of this collection that forms part of the book Gendered Institutions and Women's Political Representation in Africa. It was published in December 2020 in a series called Africa Now series, which is a cooperation between the Nordic Africa Institute and ZBook/Bloomsbury. So the focus of the book is on the meso level, with a focus on, because much research has had either a focus at the micro level with a focus on women's individual capacity, or perhaps rather lack of capacity to engage in political debates, or alternatively at the macro level, where they have kind of, in a quite deterministic way, it has been stated that, for example, electoral systems or patriarchy have influenced negatively on women's political representation. But this approach focuses on the meso level with a focus on the formal and informal institution. So there's a focus in the book generally on gendering institutions and the interaction between formal and informal institution. And I think the newness in the book is actually the combination of feminist institutionalism, women's political representation, and the African case studies, kind of highlighting how the African empirical context speaks back to feminist institutionalism. And the question of women's political representation is a kind of old feminist debate, but the combination of these three elements kind of highlights the newness. And as Georgina said, it has got 8 case studies with success and non-success countries. And by that, it is implied that it is in terms of the level of women's political representations, and the success countries are those that have actually adopted Quota. So the book is available with open access at the NIE homepage, and here is the link for the book. I also wanted to highlight and recognize all the authors in the book. Of course, we are happy to have, we have Amanda and we have Asiechi with us here today, but there are also a number of others. And what is characteristic of this volume is that most of the authors are actually scholars from the African continent. So the research questions that have kind of guided the book and its empirical investigations are: why have women's political representation developed so unevenly on the African continent? And which role do formal and informal institutions play in explaining the uneven development in Africa? And also a kind of mapping of exactly which institutions are we talking about in relation to women's political representations in an African context. And also the last questions: how could an African feminist institutionalism be characterized, if we can speak of an African feminist institutionalism? So I wanted to kind of highlight some of the Ghanaian context in terms of women's political representations. Historically, the colonial powers excluded female figures like queen mothers and magasia in politics through this indirect ruling with a focus on chiefs. But there are female political icons like Queen Mothers Ya Asantewaa and Ya Akaye that played a major role in the struggle for independence. Ya Asantewaa, for example, gathered around 40 to 50,000 people in the struggle against the British in the Ashanti region. And she has played a very remarkable role and is still referred to in the Ghanaian context. In Ghana, women gained the right to vote and stand for elections in 1954, that is 3 years before Ghana's independence. And it was one of the first countries in sub-Saharan Africa to gain independence. It was also one of the first countries in Africa to introduce a quota on 10 reserved seats for women in 1960. This was done by Kwame Nkrumah, which was kind of a believer in Pan-Africanism. And it was also done as a recognition of the role that women played in the independence movement, struggling alongside him, especially the female traders who were kind of opposing to the colonial powers and their monopoly of trading. In Ghana, there has been free elections since 1992, which is actually also quite early in an African context, with formally a multi-party system, but in reality, it's actually 2 parties that are ruling or governing, because these 2 parties, they actually have more than almost 98, 99% of the votes. I need to say that this introduction of the quota, it died with the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah because it was tied to his party, Convention People's Party. So it died in 1966. The ruling president, which has been re-elected in year 2020 from the new Patriotic Party, he was actually appointed as a gender champion for the African Union in 2017, among other things, for the focus on women's political representation. Ghana has also adopted a range of instruments internationally, but also African instruments in favor of women's political representation. For example, the Maputo Protocol by Jane Platform for Action, the CEDAW Convention, etc. And yet, in the recent election, there was only 14.6 female parliamentarians elected, and that was actually a small increase from the previous election in 2016. So what my research is pointing at is that there are some informal institutions that persist, that is preventing women from gaining office in Ghana. And here I have found that feminist institutionalism as an approach has been very useful in thinking about these informal institutions and formal institutional spaces, and especially useful in this context where politics is characterized by informality and also by patronage networks. And it's kind of the first step to address these informal institutional barriers is to identify how they look like and their character. So one of the informal institutional barrier is this politics of insults, ridicule, and rumors working against women in politics. There is a labeling of female members of parliament in very stereotypical ways. The extreme labeling is kind of as witches, which happened to the running mate of the major opposition party. There's also a labeling of female MPs as ya as en toi, which perhaps you should think would be a compliment, but the way the female MPs has taken this in is that it means a very strong woman, but also a woman with masculine traits. So it's not something that is understood stated in a positive way. They are also labeled often as prostitutes, etc. There is a questioning of their gender and sexuality, so they are much more under scrutiny than their fellow male parliamentarians with comments on looks, hair, and body. And this also kind of marks politics as a misogynist and hostile space for women. There is a new report out from an organization called Genset that states that there are no sanctions in political parties for this kind of semiotic violence. And in this report, 100 people have been asked and 72% have been exposed to verbal abuse. There are, of course, also other forms of violence against women MPs, but I will limit myself to this here. And then there is the question of monetarization of politics, where the plural majority system is not working in favor of women, and women are kind of left on their own to campaign from an often economically disadvantaged position because they have to negotiate with their husbands over the spending of resources for campaigning. And then in addition, there are those clientelistic relations in politics with client-patron networks expecting some handouts during election times. And sometimes it's actually labeled the cocoa season in Ghana. And in the latest election, of course, it has been a difficult economic situation during COVID, which has not really lessened that burden. there are reports documented that women actually spend less on most parts, or except from campaigning, because there's a need for them to work harder to become more visible. So they spend more on the part on media. Also, there is this indication of whenever a woman MP receives gifts for her campaign, there is this focus on rumors of sexual favors in exchange for these gifts. In Ghana, what has been done is a kind of initiative to have the filing fee, a kind of layering, but I'm arguing that this is far too little, because the main spending is actually on the campaign trail. So I brought in some quotations from some of these female MPs, where one is stating how she was labeled as a prostitute officially in her constituency, where an opponent kind of brought up 3 men who kind of stated that they had slept with her, which was not true. There's also another example of a female MP that have been criticized and received comments about her makeup and so on, instead of focusing on the political issues. With this monetization of politics, there are examples of women who have lost because of lack of funds. And the other one is a kind of statement about how they see the introduction of quota as a kind of solution, and how much money means in the elections. So a question that I often get when I talk about the book is, so how do we actually identify these informal institutions, because of exactly their character as informal and kind of being in the shadows and being less visible. So many of the chapters in the book has a focus on political ethnography that also includes or uses the method political ethnography that is also relevant for the Ghana chapter. So there is a kind of focus on localized version of the informal, with a use of qualitative methods such as participant observation, semi-structures, interview, and very extensive field research. And that involves field research over a longer period of time to establish this familiarity, relations, and trust to identify these informal institutions. There's also this acknowledgement of the concept of strong objectivity, placing the subject of knowledge under the same scrutiny as the object of knowledge. So in the case of the Ghana chapter, it has been participant observation from dialogues on women's political representations and presence in, for example, the Parliament Cafe, to have informal talks with the women's politicians. There's also been semi-structured interviews with women MPs from the 2 major political parties, women's organizers, because the political parties are divided in a sense that they have specific women organizers and youth organizers, etc. And also interviews with representatives from the leadership. And it has been fieldwork over longer periods with several research days in Ghana. There's also one chapter, namely the chapter on Zimbabwe, where there has been a use of media analysts kind of highlighting the stereotypical representations of women in the media and looking a bit more broader into the societal representations of women in politics. Or not representation, societal perceptions of women in politics. The book is kind of a first step towards identifying a kind of an African feminist institutionalism. And the first step that many of the chapters kind of highlights or refer to is a kind of re-excavating of the past beyond the colonial, analyzing, that means analyzing the negative influences of colonization and also searching for alternative reference point. So it's about contextualizing feminist institutionalism. There's been a kind of memory work as the past, present, and future are interlocked, and recovering the past provides an opportunity to understand the present and regender the institutions in the future. A number of the chapters have accounts of processes of colonization through which women lost their powers. For example, the chapter on Kenya highlights how economic power and control over cattle and political power became vested with the male elders in the Maasai communities. There's also, as alternative reference points, this focus on female political icons from pre-colonial times and from the independence movement. For example, in the case of Ghana, this Yaa Asantewaa, and Nigeria, there's a highlighting of 8 women from the palace ruling alongside a king. And from Tanzania, there's a focus on Bibi Titi Mohammed, who played a role in the independence movement and who also became the first women in the government by Julius Nyerere. So this is one of the first steps, which is very particular to the African context. The second step is kind of more underlying. It kind of questions what feminist institutionalism means in different contexts, and kind of questions which understandings of both feminism and of institutions are actually at play here. It speaks about references to African feminism like nego-feminism, which is supposed to mean both no ego with a focus on balance and compromise, and negotiation around multiple systems of oppression with a focus on inclusion, cooperation, and accommodation. And there is a reference to Nekela, which is a Nigerian African feminist. So it kind of points towards more localized versions of feminisms. But of course, other versions of African feminisms are also possible, which is something that is highlighted in the introduction to the book. But it also kind of calls for other research on feminism with using the approach of feminist institutionalism to kind of reflect on which underlying definitions of feminism are at play. There's also some questioning of understandings of institutionalisms in feminist institutionalism, and a kind of reference to a symbolic feminist institutionalism with a focus on sites for commemoration of women political icons. And this is in the chapter of on Tanzania, with a focus on symbols of Bibi Titi Mohammed. And it's a kind of an attempt to rewrite African history, increasing their visibility. And the last step is a kind of the use of African concepts and feminist institutionalism, and the need to kind of develop specific concepts as theorizing should start from African empirical realities. For example, there is a reference to the First Lady syndrome and a further development of this in the case of South Africa. There's also some reference to this in the chapter on Ghana. And then there's this politics of insults, ridicule, and rumors from the chapter on Ghana as an example of new and other concepts that kind of emerges from the African context. But this is also a point for further exploration. And I think I will leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Diana. That was fascinating. Lots of food for thought there. And I'll pass over now to Ashati Lorraine Chiweza, who is an associate professor in public administration in the Department of Political and Administrative Studies at Chancellor College at the University of Malawi. And her main research interests are in gender, local governance, development, and political economy. And Dr. Chiweza has been the principal researcher and coordinator of several international collaborative research programs, including one on democratization, political participation, and gender in Malawi. And she's currently working on a collaborative project with the University of Bergen called Money Talks, Gendered Electoral Financing in Democratic and Democratizing States. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Georgina, for that introduction. Let me mention that I was one of the authors in this particular book, and it was a pleasure to work with Diana, Amanda, and various other authors. In terms of the Malawi case, I thought that I should do very briefly talk about the approach that we use, the feminist institutionalism, that it is a new institutionalist approach that looks at how gender norms operate within institutions. And in this case, institutions, the idea is to talk about the rules of the game, both formal and informal. And this has been highlighted by Georgina as well, and how institutional processes construct and maintain gender power dynamics. So the key argument for the feminist institutionalism is that these institutions are not neutral. So the norms and the rules are gendered, and we therefore produce gendered outcomes. So methodologically, the emphasis is the gender as the primary unit that focuses on how the institutions are gendered and how their formal and informal rules play a part in shaping political life. So the background to the Malawi case is that for 3 years, the country, female activists, as well as donors and government, they had been running a funding campaign known as the 50-50 campaign program to try and improve the numbers of women getting into parliament. The idea behind 50-50 is that at the end of the day, the electoral processes, we should have 50 of men and 50 of women. Now, the background to Malawi's political system is that since 1966, Malawi was a one-party state. But in 1994, Malawi changed to a democratic multi-party state. And since 1994, the numbers of women getting into parliament have been very minimal, of course, gradually rising over the years. The Malawi's electoral system is faced past the post. So whoever gets, a vote over, than the rest is the one who wins. And Malawi does not have any gender quotas, whether at the party level or at the national level. Candidates can either run on a party ticket or they can also stand as independent candidates. But most of them prefer to stand on a party ticket. So what we find is that the formal rules in Malawi, that's electoral rules, the constitution, they stipulate eligibility of parliamentary candidates, but the political parties are free to choose their own method of how they select their candidates. So the parties will actually say that they have rules, but none of them has a written outline of these rules. So the study on which this chapter was actually based set to understand these rules, the ones that they call formal in brackets. They say formal, but they are not written in any document. It's set to understand those rules and also to understand how the various actors understand those rules and what happens in practice. So through key informant interviews with women who went through the candidate selection process of various parties, and also the party leaders at various levels, from the grassroots to the national level, the study focused on uncovering informal rules within political party institutions and how women political actors were constrained or enabled in the candidate selection processes. So in Malawi, what happens is before the national election, the parties have to choose their candidates, those people that they are going to sponsor, that are going to stand for a particular party. And this is, a process that sifts out the candidates that will eventually, stand, but also that will eventually emerge. And over the years, what has happened is that the numbers of women standing on a political party ticket, those numbers have been going down, and there have been quite a number of women standing as independent candidates. So what became clear is that the male political networks from two political parties used informality in different stages of the candidate selection process in the 2014 and 2019 and hijacked the process in favor of their preferred male candidates and exclusion of some female candidates. So clearly this was the dissonance between what is known as the orally handed down rules and the practice, on the ground. So although these rules are not written down, but they are communicated orally, and they're also enforced through the officially sanctioned, channels from the National Executive Committee of the party down to the region, the district, and the branch at the very local level. So this is what they would call the formal. But if you look at the Douglas North's categorization, is that the formal, in most cases, it is written down. But in practice, what happens is that there's this dissonance between those orally handed down rules and the practice on the ground. The Malawi case shows that the formal rules, the ones that were transmitted orally to the female candidates in this process, left some room for interpretation, and they were also disregarded in favor of the male candidates. The male candidates, in some cases, sidetracked the selection and identification of delegates. So the delegates that all the candidates knew were going to be the nominators in those processes, the male elites will change those delegates last minute, maybe a day before, or even on the same day of the party electoral process. So they would also have sudden changes of venues, and introduction of new delegate areas to promote the male candidates in a kind of chaotic, election process. So this tended to not to favor many female candidates, but also the female candidates were deliberately kept out of the loop for crucial information on the times, dates, and venues in relation to the candidate selection process. So sometimes they will get the information this week, next week the information will change. Maybe just a day before, the information will also change. The preferred male candidates, in some cases, were declared as winners by influential local political decision makers, despite evidence to the contrary. And what was also clear is that there were no clear mechanisms of addressing the issues that were happening during those electoral processes. And even within the channels, of the party, there were no clear mechanisms so that you can actually complain and get the issues resolved. Now, given this background, what I noted, but also drawing from the experiences that have been documented in the book from other countries, what I note is that the feminist institutionalism is actually a strong theoretical approach that actually does, it enables uncovering of the gendered consequences of informal party recruitment and of local influence over party candidate selection. It does indeed provide an explanation to female underrepresentation and the domination of men with the solutions, such as gender quotas. So when it comes to uncovering the factors, behind, the underrepresentation, the approach is actually very strong. But what I find is that there is not much on how the African feminists can actually reshape the patriarchal institutions. And a lot of literature in Malawi has focused on how to get the women, into parliament, and what are these factors. So I find that it offers little in terms of how then they can reshape the patriarchal institutions, and in the words of Ahikile, how women can innovate to win over the goodwill of men in the patronage networks. So this is in Malawi, I think, at the heart of the debate around moving from descriptive to substantive representation beyond the ballot, how to support women to perform and overcome patriarchal tendencies. And I think as a result of this, most of the initiatives by activists, as well as the state and other non-state actors, they've tended to focus on the process to the ballot and getting into parliament. And there isn't much around when they are in parliament or these other political decision-making bodies, how to support them so that they overcome the patriarchal tendencies, and then they can substantively contribute, whether to policy making and other practical elements around political decision making. Now, I have drawn from the work from Tanzania and also from Botswana that's documented actually in this book. They talk about the role of African feminism in reshaping patriarchal institutions. In particular, there is an article in the book by Fosse and Jacques. They talk about nego-feminism as the feminism of negotiation, which is linked to African cultures of compromise and balance. And they talk about this as an analytical tool to renegotiate and regender institutions. And the building of institutions are not just how women are limited and shaped by the existing institutions.
And in particular, women in citizenship, the national gender machinery. Are you back?
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
I just saw a note that I was disconnected. Yeah, can I continue?
Yeah. We were just going to go to Amanda, but maybe we'll go back to you. Sorry about that. So Amanda, we'll put you on hold if that's okay. Sorry about this.
All right. Okay. I hope nothing like that happens again so I can finish. Okay. Where did you lose me?
I think you were on a slide on African feminisms.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let me go to that one. Right. Okay. So what I was saying is that I drew insights from some of the work that's been documented in the book, in particular Tanzania and Botswana. So I was saying that there is a chapter there by Fosse and Jacques. They talk about nego-feminism as the feminism of negotiation, linked to African cultures of compromise and balance, as a useful analytical tool to renegotiate and regender institutions and the building of the institutions. And so Nemeka describes Nego feminism as an African feminism, which borders on when, where, and how to detonate the so-called patriarchal landmines, but also how to go around them. In other words, looking at, yes, the networks are there, but how to negotiate and create strategic alliances. I think the other area that I found, interesting from the work that's been done in Botswana is the role of African feminism in promoting African women's agency. That's moving from the individual women to collective processes of empowerment. When you look at African contexts, they are not very much, individualistic, and there's a lot that's communal. In Malawi, in particular, there's a lot that's communal. But when you look at the competitive elements in the democratic processes, they tend to emphasize, the individual. So lessons from the work on Letsoma from Botswana, they do actually show how mutual mistrust between women from different political parties needs to be overcome through song and storytelling with a focus on common gendered experiences to establish safe spaces for the female candidates. Thank you very much for your attention.
Amanda is a professor of political science at the University of Stellenbosch and is currently a distinguished professor holding a National Research Foundation chair in gender politics. And Amanda was a commissioner for the South African Commission for Gender Equality between 2012 and 2014. And she has an edited book forthcoming in October this year on feminist institutionalism in South Africa, designing for equality, which actually looks at the experiences of the South African Gender Commission. And in broader terms, her research is on South African politics and gender politics.
So I just want to say something about the importance of the book, because the book, it's really the first book of its kind on feminist institutionalism in Africa. And now looking at feminist institutionalism as defined by gendered rules, norms, and processes, and that gender constructions are embedded in the logic of political institutions. So it makes the link between descriptive representation and substantive representation and gendered institutions. Now, my chapter is titled Feminist Institutionalism, Women's Representation and State Capture in South Africa. The issue of South Africa is that it's very different from other African countries, and the difference, of course, are linked to a negotiated transition to democracy, where the feminist women's movement demanded certain structures in the state. They demanded the inclusion of a women's charter that was sort of the claims they were included in the Bill of Rights. So the history is different from many of the histories in other African countries. And Diana mentioned the issue of, for example, first wives, or the first wife syndrome, where the wives of African presidents capture these institutions, which is something that does not apply to South Africa, but it is an important concept on which there's also quite a substantive body of literature that's been produced over the years. Now, for us, we use the quota system as a fast track. We have first a 30% quota, a voluntary quota by the ruling party, and in 2009 that changed to 50%. But how institutions are shaped contribute to the legitimacy of governments. So feminist institutionalism produces certain path dependencies over time. That's called the logic of appropriateness. And it constrains some types of behavior and it encourages other types of behavior. But the norms of institutions are not gender neutral, but form gender regimes. So who are in decision-making positions, who get to deal with priority issues, who gets to be have a voice, and who gets to be in positions of power through these formal and informal rules. Now, at the moment, we have 45% women in government. So we have descriptive representation. But the question is, do we have substantive representation that actually, where women can pursue policy goals and that they can actually set a feminist agenda? Now, during political transitions, institutional blueprints need to be put in place. Otherwise, new institutions become exposed to the stickiness of old rules. Now, the benefit in the South African case was that there were no old rules. The apartheid government had only one woman in parliament in its entire history. So there was nothing to go back to. So we could actually start to craft new institutions. And in that regard, feminist activists and academics played an important role in the design of the institution or the structures in the state. And I was part of that design, a group of feminists who worked on the design. And so we rejected outright a women's ministry because ministries always carry, the problem of ghettoization of gender issues. So everything gets parked in a women's ministry and you get very little policy coming out of that ministry. So what we did was we asked for a package of institutions. So on the different tiers of government, in parliament, in the executive, and also outside, in terms of a statutory body in the constitution, we had the Commission of Gender Equality, or for gender equality. So in parliament, there's the multi-party women's caucus. There's the there was. Most of these structures are now dysfunctional, and I will talk about that. A women's empowerment unit in the Speaker's office, the Joint Monitoring Committee on the Quality of Life and the Status of Women. So in Parliament, we have portfolio committees for every state department, and they make legislation and policy. And so this Joint Monitoring Committee was then a monitoring committee that had to monitor at that point about 30 state departments. And you can imagine the enormous task for one monitoring committee to do that. But they actually, what made this a feminist project was that when, after the first freedom election, women went into, the leaders of the women's movement went into parliament, and most of them were feminists. So they kept the feminist project going in that first 5 years of democracy. But by 2009, with the installation of Jacob Zuma as the president of South Africa, the president that's now well known for the enormous corruption and state capture that happened in South Africa, together with the ANC Women's League. Now, this is another problem in the African context, is that political parties have women's wings, women's auxiliaries, and they called, in the South African case, the African National Congress Women's League, that really are anti-feminist, and they sort of, where they are involved, they follow a nationalist project. So women as the mothers of the nation, but it's not a feminist project. So by 2009, they supported Jacob Zuma, and they were actually the deciding vote that made Zuma the president. And then these structures that were created in the state were being rolled back in favor of a ministry. So we got the ministry in 2009, the Ministry of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities, consolidating the dispersed sites of power into one site. Now, this was the thing about having these dispersed sites that was really important, because women could insert issues into agenda in different places, and they could actually have strategies to work from different sides. So this ministry, you can already see it's a problem. It's women, it's youth, it's people with disabilities, and for all of them, strategic plans had to be developed, institutionalized, and implemented by one minister. And this was actually a continuation of the fusion of the ANC as a party with the state. Right now, we cannot tell the difference between party interest and state interest because there's an absolute fusion between the two. And this enabled state capture under the Zuma presidency. Now, what is state capture? It is the repurposing of institutions of the state in a way that they are structured, governed, managed, and funded for different purposes for which they were created. So what this means, if you put feminist structures or structures for women in the state and you change the mandate of the state, what happens to those structures? And this is what my chapter is about. So patronage networks replace feminist inclined women with compliant women. So these women, the state is riddled now with factions, and these women belong to factions. So they are compliant and they keep men in position. So it's the loyalty basically to the men in the party. And if we look at Ellen Bornegaard's work on homosocial capital, then this is what it is. It's the patronage networks. And even though women are part of these networks, it does not benefit them. It benefits the men in forms of homosocial capital, but it does not benefit the women, even though they are loyal. But there's nothing coming out of that that enable any policy making in favor of women. So since 2009, we've had 5 ministers of women who could not reach more than 40% of their strategic targets. Most of the time, it's 30% or below, and they make no policy. It's absolutely, everything gets parked there, and there's no policy coming out of it. This then, combined with what we call slate politics in South Africa, undermines the quota system. So the quota system works as, we have a zebra, what's called a zebra list or a zipper list. So every second name on the list is the name of a woman. But slate politics is a list of names that's decided beforehand, before the election, and this is on local, provincial, and national level. And the order of that slate cannot change. So what you'll see is that the slate will have mostly men on them, and then 1 or 2 women at the bottom. So that already creates a huge problem in terms of the zebra system, quota system. So, and then it gets further, the male dominance and the male regimes in the state gets entrenched by cadre deployment. Now, cadre deployment means that if somebody is, for example, needed, a politician is needed somewhere, it's not getting there through an election, but it's getting sent to a position of power to keep the interests of the ANC intact. Or the other reason it's used is that when somebody is found guilty of corruption, they will just be moved to another province. So you do something in province A, and then you are found out, and then you get deployed to province B, where you can continue with the type of corruption that you were involved in. So what it is, it's a mix of procedural manipulations, co-optation, and invented tradition. And so those who are loyal to the party gets rewarded, deployed, and deployed to new positions of patronage. And the Women's League is absolutely, they ensure compliant women who are loyal to the factions. And what's happened to the Commission for Gender Equality? So this is what we call a Chapter 9 body. That's Chapter 9 of the South African Constitution, in which there is the all the monitoring bodies are in Chapter 9. So it's the Commission for Gender Equality, the Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, and so on. So they have extraordinary powers of subpoena. It has powers to investigate. It has powers to call public hearings. It can actually take government to task. But what the Women's League has done in the past couple of years is to deploy Women's League members to become commissioners. Now, commissioners are nominated by stakeholders, and then they are interviewed in Parliament. And how the delegations in Parliament work is that the biggest party always get to send the most delegates for the interviews, and then they vote. So they can outvote any other party. And that means that right now, there are no person, no commissioner who is not a member of the ANC Women's League. So the oversight over the Parliament specifically has basically disappeared. And that is a capture, in another form of capture. It's the capture of an independent commission, an autonomous commission by the Women's League. And then promoting this regressive nationalist agenda. So what are the implications then for feminist institutionalism when you have a state that's captured, you have your monitoring bodies captured by the party's Women's League? It makes these institutions very vulnerable for repurposing to the state. Because they are institutionalized through the goodwill of male-dominated government. So how how do women end up in these structures? Of course, they need to be elected through elections. And so if the quota system is compromised, if the state is really repurposed, they are completely dependent on the goodwill of the men in government. So informal rules become more important than formal rules, and most decision-making takes place in a very clandestine way. So that disadvantages feminist institutions. So what you have is a shadow state operating in parallel to the formal state. So what happens in the formal state is not the outcome of decision-making processes. And we see this in terms of how policy is being made now. There's really very limited discussion of important policy documents on the floor of Parliament. It goes into portfolio committees that are captured by the ruling party. And so what you get is that decisions are taken elsewhere. They're taken in back rooms, they are taken in places where women may not even be present. So there's sort of what we call a shadow state. So the lack of attention to women's issues then manifest is as a lack of political will. So you will hear people saying, well, there's no political will to do this, that, to implement this law, to create a policy. But it's not really about political will. It is about the fact that decisions are being made, but they are not made in the interest of women, and they're made in the shadow state. So what happens then is that the logic of appropriateness disappears, and it makes impossible to set a feminist agenda, and it then leads to a lack of substantive representation. Yeah, so that I think is my chapter on the South African situation. But I think what is really important here is that if you take the concept of feminist institutionalism and you ask if it has traveled, I think it is these concepts are useful to apply to states in Africa, because it shows us then how different, when you have weak states, and this is the story of the African continent, that states are weak, and that they are, in many cases, some of them are failed states. And then you have patron-client networks that is extensive and part of the political culture. So it makes it very difficult to have these formal rules apply to these states, and you can see how it subverts and undermines the logic of appropriateness that's really necessary for state or feminist institutionalism to work. So I think it's applicable, but I also think what the research then shows is how different the context is in Africa, and the things that we need to look at to better understand how the gender regimes, for example, work in the state. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you to all the presenters for 3 fantastic contributions that have really highlight for us and make us think about the nature of feminisms, the nature of women's agency, particularly the nature and definitions of formal and informal rules, as well as all these issues around institutional creation, how we get institutional change, and again, institutional rollback and capture. And given that we've got just under 15 minutes left, I'll open it up to any questions before going back to the panel. So if you'd like to use the raised hand function, if you've got a question, a comment, any thought or response. Ellen, if you'd like to ask your question, make your comments.
Yes, thank you all so much for really interesting presentations, and thank you so much for writing this book. I think it's such a valuable contribution to the field that we'll continue to discuss and learn from for a long time. I have many questions and comments, but I think I'll 2 short ones in the interest of time. I was wondering, I guess, mostly perhaps in relation to the Malawi context. I thought it was very interesting, the question that it kind of ended on, like, how should feminists innovate then? What is it that we need to do? And to kind of think about compromise and balance and building strategic alliances. To me, that, I mean, that really is the next thing, of course, the next step we need to figure out, like, how do we then change this? But I was thinking that what is kind of strategically needed is then kind of identification of the problem. So what is the problem really here? Is it that, because I recognize so much about your depiction in many ways about the Malawi context, how there are seem to be different rules actually in place for men and women and different meeting places. But to what extent is that deliberate? Is it really kind of a strategic game to keep women out? Or is it more kind of a continuation of protecting your own power and doing things the way you've always done them? And does that then matter for, I mean, what the problem is matters then for what the appropriate solution or the strategic alliance would be, in a sense. So I would just like to hear a bit more about that, to what extent you read this as kind of deliberate sexism, if you will, or if it's more about defending status quo. And then I just have a very kind of general question, I guess, to the whole panel about, I mean, for me, feminist institutionalism has helped me so much in comparing across contexts. It's been kind of a language that has made it possible for me and Meryl Kenny, for instance, to compare Thailand and Scotland, which is not perhaps the most evident comparison. To what extent, when you have done the work that you have done, do you think those comparisons are possible, or is it more in the kind of, I mean, institutions can be compared, I think, because they're kept at that meso level. But is it more in the political capital, the different types of capital that's needed, the kind of what's valuable in the political game? Is that where we need to contextualize and differentiate, or what would be your kind of what would be your take on the prospects of comparing across contexts with the help of feminist institutionalism? Sorry, that wasn't very short, but.
Okay, maybe if we could start with Diana, go in the order of presentations and start with Diana, if you want to respond to Ellen's question.
Yeah, I don't know if there was any particular question to me, but about the comparisons, yeah, I guess maybe that's where the book could have done a bit more. I think you're right about that, than it actually has, because, but I think maybe we have to look at this book as a kind of first attempt to kind of combine these issues. So your question is very relevant. I mean, in terms of what, and it's also clear that actually the chapters are quite diverse in terms of their focus and so on. There's also, for example, one chapter, as I stated, that has a focus on media analysis, which is kind of, yeah, quite different. I'm not really sure that I have a definitive answer for you right now, actually. But it's something that I want to reflect more about. So thank you for that. Maybe Amanda can has anything to say about this.
Yes, if I could come in here, sorry, Ashyati, but I think to speak to the comparison, you know, I think if you truly do comparative research, then you have to, you know, most similar systems design or dissimilar. We didn't go about it that way because these are case studies. And I think, you know, in the future, if we want to do this comparative work, we need to, you know, look at, you know, the type of system, the presidential systems, you know, with executive presidents or parliamentary systems and so on. And they are quite diverse in Africa. So, but that then truly you will design as a comparative study, and that would probably be very useful to do that.
Let me attempt to address it. When you look at the developments in Malawi, I do not think that it's deliberate sexism, but rather I think it's trying to defend the status quo, and most of the parties, their focus is on winning. So they try to look for candidates that will help them as a party to win. So I think there's a perception that it is the men, because they have more money to support the electoral processes. That's a perception. Okay? And of course, there have been other studies that have shown that women have economic challenges. But the reason why I talk about the strategic alliances is that the activists in civil society, they have, you know, over the years, tried to come together with the CSOs that are actually led and driven, you know, by men, you know, to lobby the political parties. But also we've had what is known as the Women's Caucus of Parliament. And this caucus brings together women from various parties. And what they have done is to engage with the men, you know, in Parliament, in the process of reforming or introducing particular legislation. So this whole idea of strategic alliances, you know, is something that we are able to see, although in a small way. So to answer your question, I don't think that it is really deliberate, but I think it's defending the status quo and the parties trying to ensure that they get candidates that will get them to win. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from anyone in the audience?
In the meantime, just say something about the multi-party caucus in South Africa, which is something that does not work. And it doesn't work because women seem to be unable to work across party lines. They toe the party policies or the party line, and then it just means that they cannot come to any agreement on gender issues. So it's not been working since 1994. even though it exists in name.
Yeah, maybe I can also share about this aspect on strategic alliances that in the case of Ghana, the women MPs, they actually do describe how they kind of try to lobby some of the men that they see as more sensitive towards these issues. So there's some kind of language, I mean, and you can also imagine with such a small number of women in parliament, if they didn't have any male alliances, they're really, like Elin describes with this concept of homosocial capital, I mean, they're so dependent on creating alliances with their male MPs because they're only this 14.6% women in parliament. So they kind of identify those. But I mean, the way they do it, I mean, and the way they speak about it is that some of these men are talking about, you know, praising their mothers and so on. And then you kind of wonder why they don't really praise their fellow female MPs in that sense. And there's also a women's caucus in Ghana. But at the moment, the political climate between the two dominant parties is very tense, actually. So they don't seem to be able to agree on all that many things. And especially before, during, and after the election, it's really heated. Although they do describe that sometimes they have kind of working relations on some aspects, but it does get very heated, and I think it was quite striking how many of the women MPs spoke about how kind of isolated they felt.
Just to end on, I was wondering if all the panelists could very quickly just tell us what they thought the key takeaways for feminist institutionalism are that your African case, the cases kind of brought to mind. So maybe start with Ashati. What are the key takeaways for feminist institutionalism from the African cases that you've looked at?
Yes, I think, you know, for me, one of the issues, and it's also shown in my forthcoming book, is that you can design and you can have the best intentions with design to accommodate feminist issues or feminist projects in the state. But how the state then in the end operates and functions really plays a big role in how women's agency in those structures then work out. And I think, you know, where you have these very strong patron-client networks, it's very difficult for women to set that agenda. So, you know, I think maybe what we also need to look at is in the informal networks among women. So what type of homosocial capital do you have among women? Now, the big problem in South Africa is that it is absolutely impossible to do research with the state. We do not get interviews, not from the ruling party. There is an unspoken rule that they don't speak to academics, they don't speak to students. So my students, for example, has lost semesters trying to get interviews. So the state, in a sense, then becomes a black box that you cannot know what's going on. And you know, I think that's very detrimental to research projects and epistemological projects. So I think, you know, and I think South Africa in that case is also very different. I think in other countries in Africa, it's easier to do research. And just to end to say about comparison is that we also need to think about comparisons that would include Francophone countries. And none of us are French speaking, but the political culture in Francophone countries are very different from Anglophone. So that I think would also bring a different type of dimension to a comparative project. Thanks.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming and for the three presenters, for three fascinating papers that I think have given us a lot of food for thought and a lot of ideas about as I say, the how we think about formal and informal rules, this whole unwritten dimension of formal rules, the nature of agency, and different forms of feminism, like the sort of neo-feminism. So on that note, thanks to everyone, and to Sarah for putting together and doing all the technical work on this and getting up incredibly early to make it all happen. Okay, thank you everyone.